Right, well, we are starting to approach the end of our series on the parables of Jesus. We'll probably have just 2 or 3 more weeks, and then we will move into something else. But for this morning, we have the parable of the wise and foolish builders, taken from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27, as well as Luke 6, verses 47 through 49. And they're short, so I'm just going to read them both this morning. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." And then from the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, "I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood arose, the river burst against that house, but could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the river burst against it, immediately it fell, and great was the ruin of that house." Well, there have been numerous examples of engineering failures throughout history, some of which resulted in catastrophe. Whether these disasters were the result of poor planning or cutting corners or a failure to listen to experts, many of these tragedies could have been avoided altogether or at least significantly lessened if people simply would have done the right thing. One of the most famous examples of this, of course, occurred in 1912 in the sinking of the Titanic. Historians point to a number of factors that, when combined, created a completely unnecessary tragedy. To begin with, the powers that be cut corners to save money rather than listen to experts. And so the rivets used to hold together the hull of the ship were cheap. They were comprised of iron mixed with too much slag, which caused them to become brittle and break far too easily in cold weather. And so for a ship cruising through extremely cold water, this was a disaster waiting to happen. Second, when it came to engineering the ship, the Titanic was in uncharted territory because it was the largest ship ever built at the time. And so we can't necessarily fault the engineer for failing to seal the bulkheads, which would have prevented the entire ship from flooding. But we can speculate that perhaps if more engineers had been consulted, this tragedy could have been averted. Third, the captain of the ship refused to listen to experts and heed their advice, which was to significantly slow down or even halt movement altogether during the nighttime hours, because there were a large number of icebergs in the water. Supposedly, the Titanic was going near its top speed on a moonless night when it struck that iceberg. Had the captain done what he had been told to do, the catastrophe would have been avoided. Fourth, and those of you who saw the movie are aware of this, the Titanic only had 20 lifeboats, which was only enough to carry a third of the people on board. But I guess when you're convinced you have constructed an indestructible ship lifeboats are deemed unnecessary. In addition, as the movie correctly portrayed, many of the lifeboats were not loaded to capacity. Some of them were less than half full, which demonstrates how fear and likely privilege can lead people to do some pretty awful things. Now, there were a number of other factors as well, which you can read about if you want to. But more than likely, if enough people would have listened to the right people and would have acted accordingly, the Titanic would have safely arrived in New York City, sparing the lives of thousands of people. In our scripture lesson for today, Jesus presents us with a parable about the importance of listening to and acting on his words. This morning, as we explore the parable of the wise and foolish builders, we will consider what it looks like to be a wise builder and how we can steer away from foolish building in our lives. So to begin with, as we have seen time and time again, Jesus uses images that are familiar to his audience in order to instruct and convey truth to them. So in the Palestinian region, during the summertime, there were a number of dry, sandy patches of land that appeared to be ideal locations to build a home. After all, smoothed over or packed down sand was easy to build on. It was certainly much easier than digging down until you reached a shelf of rock and built on that instead. The problem was many of these nice, easy to build upon plots of land were actually dried up riverbeds. And so even though they were dry in the summertime, when the winter came, and along with it the seasonal rains, this dry land became, in some cases, rapidly flowing rivers. And so not only did a person need to know the lay of the land before they decided to build, once they did, they needed to put in the effort to dig down and anchor their house on the shelf of rock. If they did not, they were foolish. The wind and rain and rushing water would easily consume their house. Now, Luke paints a slightly different picture because his audience for his gospel was broader than the Palestinian region. And so the imagery in his gospel simply speaks of the importance of building on a rock so that your house will withstand a flood, which we can certainly relate to. But the point in both versions of the parable is the same. The wise person will build their house on a solid foundation of rock, which will withstand the weather. The foolish person, however, will build their house on sand, which is much, much easier, but it will be destroyed by the weather. It will fall, and the fall will be great. And Jesus tells us the one who hears his words and acts on them is like that wise builder. But the person who hears his words and does not act on them is like the foolish builder. And so really, this parable is all about obedience. Obedience to the words and commands of Jesus. According to Jesus here, it is not enough to simply know what Jesus says. It is not enough to simply say you believe in what Jesus says or say a prayer to get into heaven. A person must obediently follow Jesus' teaching. Now, in both Matthew and Luke, Jesus gives this parable at the end of his largest section of teaching, or his most detailed sermon. In the case of the Gospel of Matthew, we call this the Sermon on the Mount. And so, given the context, Jesus is saying those who abide by his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount are like that wise builder in the parable. So those who, for example, commit to being merciful and pure in heart and peacemaking are wise builders. Those who forgive and seek forgiveness and love their enemies are wise builders. But those who do not commit to these attributes, who do not act on them, are foolish. They are building their lives on shifting sand, and this will result in a devastating fall. Now, we could, and maybe at some point we will, do an entire series on the Sermon on the Mount and go through each and every one of Jesus' teachings found therein, because there's a lot of them. Do not love money. Seek first the kingdom. Do not judge others, and so on. But since we are in the middle of a series on the parables of Jesus, we are going to instead consider what it looks like to build our lives on the words of Christ in a more general sense by contrasting this with building our lives on shifting sand. You see, there are many other foundations we are invited to build our lives upon besides the words of Jesus. For the sake of time this morning, we're just going to look at what are, in my opinion, two of the major ones. So first, we can build our lives on culture or society. This is one of the primary foundations many people, regardless of where they live, choose to build their lives upon. Culture is what primarily shapes their understanding of who they are, where they fit, and how they view and treat other people. And so, the values and ideas and norms of the culture primarily shape persons who build on this foundation. Wherever the culture goes, so goes this person. They are almost completely attuned to and on board with whatever is currently relevant and important to the culture at large. And so the values and ideas promoted by media, politicians, entertainers, and so on become the sand on which such people base who they are. Now, this is a very precarious foundation because the values and ideas of a culture are constantly in flux. A person building on this foundation might be swept up in believing in and acting in ways that completely go against what they once cherished and held as true. Now, sometimes this can be positive because we all need to change and grow, but it is often destructive, particularly in our culture, which seems determined to push the envelope further and further. Our culture seems intent on pushing boundaries as far as they can possibly be pushed. And this is kind of a side note, but in my opinion, this is where finding one's primary identity in what they have to offer sexually comes from. Many young people especially find their identity and worth in projecting sexuality because this is what is lauded by our culture. Culture is a lousy foundation to build upon. Now, by contrast, building a foundation on the words of Jesus provides consistency and an anchor in the midst of the ebbs and flows of cultural tides. And so when new ideas or belief systems or outlooks on existence arise, when those pelt the windows of the house, those who build on the foundation of Jesus can and will evaluate these new ideas based on the words of Jesus. When new values arise in a culture, especially ones that would fundamentally alter who we are and how we view and treat others, when these kinds of floods arise, those who build on the foundation of Jesus can and will evaluate those values based on the words of Jesus. And so no matter what arises in the culture, those who have built their lives on the rock will evaluate it based on Jesus and will then act accordingly and obediently and faithfully, which often means a willingness to diverge from the culture, which can sometimes be uncomfortable. And let me give you a particularly relevant example, given the fact that I believe we have an election rapidly approaching. As I've noted several times in recent weeks, the amount of seemingly now culturally acceptable vitriol has sunk to new lows. People in our culture are now lauded for name-calling and launching mean-spirited attacks and seeking to destroy the lives and reputations of people who disagree with them. Values such as vindictive retribution and dissociating with and demonizing those with opposing views and exaggeration of the truth and fear-mongering are now seemingly culturally acceptable and encouraged. As long as you agree with me, feel free to say and do whatever you want to destroy our enemies. And unfortunately, I think this phenomenon is revealing that many Christians on both sides of the aisle have not really solidly built their lives on the rock. Based on the words and actions of plenty of professing Christians, it appears some cultural sand has eroded the foundation, because too many Christians aren't obediently following the words of Jesus. It appears to me that too many have been convinced that either in the name of justice or in the name of conservation, the words of Jesus simply must be disregarded. And so my challenge is, before you post on Facebook or Twitter or engage with someone you disagree with over a cup of coffee, read through the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Read through it and ask yourself, does what I'm about to say demonstrate that I have built my life on the words of Jesus or not? And if the answer is no, then don't say it. Some words from John Wesley to consider in the coming weeks. John Wesley wrote, "I met those of our society who had votes in the ensuing election, and I advised them, number one, to vote without fee or reward for the person they judged most worthy. Two, to speak no evil of the person they voted against. And three, to take care their spirits were not sharpened against those that voted on the other side." In my opinion, these words are very much anchored in the foundation of Jesus. The second foundation people often build their lives upon is other people. Many people base their entire lives, their entire identity, on their relationships to other people. And so their connection with others is what primarily shapes their understanding of who they are, where they fit, and how they view and treat others. And so the values and ideas and norms of the people they interact with primarily shape people who build on this foundation. And so wherever their friends or family or coworkers go, so goes this person. They are almost completely attuned to and on board with whatever direction their social circle goes. And so relationships become the sand on which these folks build who they are. Now, don't get me wrong, this one's a little tougher because community is crucial. Jesus commanded us to be in right relationship with one another. We were not created to be in isolation. We were created by God to have fellowship with one another. and growth and improvement is nearly impossible without the help and input of others. And so my point here is not that other people are not important, or that relationships cannot be very positive and fundamental aspects of who we are as Christians. However, other people, much like culture, can provide a very shaky foundation on which to build our lives. For starters, much like culture, people are constantly in flux, right? People have good days and bad days. People can have positive seasons of life and very negative seasons of life. All of us are subject to sin and negativity and falsehood. In short, since people are broken, which all of us are, we're going to let each other down sometimes. And we're going to hurt each other sometimes. And if my foundation, the core of who I am, is built upon others, I am always going to be at the mercy of how other people are doing, as well as what other people think of me. I am constantly at the mercy of the availability of others to meet my needs. My well-being is determined by whether or not other people are steering me in the right direction and giving me good advice. And since I am a person, I cannot build my foundation on myself either. Now, I can't speak for you, but I know I am a lousy foundation to build myself upon. I know I am subject to justification of behavior and rationalization and convincing myself to take the easy way rather than the right way. Therapeutic moral deism is very popular amongst people these days. Now, if you don't know what it is, look it up. Therapeutic moral deism. I think this phenomenon describes what many in the church have settled on, primarily because their foundation is not built on Jesus, rather it's built on themselves. It allows them to believe what they want to believe, to do what they want to do, to value what they want to value. Building a foundation on people is foolish. By contrast, building a foundation on the words of Jesus provides consistency and an anchor in the midst of the ebbs and flows of human beings. And so when another person I rely on isn't there for me, or disappoints me, or hurts me, when they pelt the windows of my house, if I have built my life on the foundation of Jesus, I can find strength to deal with that situation, as well as find the grace and mercy I need to extend to that person. If another person offends me, or dismisses me, or wants nothing to do with me, if I have built my life on the foundation of Jesus, I can rest in the fact that I am created in the image of God, and I am valued, regardless of what that person thinks, because who I am and what I am worth is not found in the opinions of others. If I have built my foundation on other people, that is not the case. And if I am having one of those difficult days or seasons of life in which I have failed too many times, and I am overwhelmed by my own weakness, and I am frustrated by my lack of faith and progress, if I have built my life on the foundation of Jesus rather than on myself, I know that if I ask, it will be given to me. And if I seek, I will find. That if I knock, the door will be opened unto me. The Sermon on the Mount. Everyone there who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise person who built their house on a rock. And so let all of us this morning build our lives on the words of Jesus by learning them and by following them each and every day.